Christmas Eve, 1889, Montana Territory. The wind came down off the Bitterroot Mountains like something alive and vengeful, driving snow in curtains across the open plain, bending the lodgepole pines that lined the frozen creek behind the homestead. Inside cabin number 7 on the Callaway Road, a name no one had ever bothered to change from when the previous owner had staked it, Thomas Aldridge stood at the frost-laced window and watched the long white road give way to nothing. He had been watching for an hour, perhaps longer. He could not say with certainty. Time had a way of pooling in the corners of this cabin lately, going still and stagnant the way creek water did beneath ice. Behind him, his 7-year-old daughter, Clara, sat cross-legged on the braided rug before the fireplace, arranging a circle of dried holly berries and pinecones she had gathered from the woodpile that morning. She was making something, an altar, perhaps, or a wreath, or simply the instinctive decorating of a child who believed Christmas deserved ceremony even when her father had forgotten how to observe it. She hummed as she worked. A carol. Thomas recognized the melody before he could stop himself. Good King Wenceslas, the one her mother had loved, the one Alina had sung every December since before Clara was born, the one Thomas had not been able to hear without leaving the room for the better part of 3 years. He did not leave the room now. He simply stood at the window and let the melody fall over him like cold water, bracing and unavoidable. 3 years. 3 years since fever had moved through the valley like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. Alina had taken ill in November and was gone before January arrived. Clara had been 4 years old and had asked, with the terrible directness of small children, whether Mama was coming back the same way spring came back, and Thomas had not known how to answer. He still did not know. He had simply poured himself into work, fence lines, cattle, the endless labor of keeping a homestead alive through brutal Montana winters, and left the question unanswered, suspended between them like smoke. He had loved Alina with everything in him. He was no longer entirely certain what was left. Papa, Clara's voice was soft but precise. She knew not to startle him. She had learned, gradually, and with the sad wisdom of children who must learn their parents' grief, that he needed to be spoken to like a deer being approached at the edge of the tree line. Do you think the stage made it through Alderton Pass? Thomas turned from the window. Roads are bad, could be delayed. Clara set down a pinecone very carefully and looked at him, but she might still come today. He turned back to the window. She might. The mail-order bride. He had answered the advertisement in the Helena Weekly 4 months ago, not from any softening in his heart. His heart, in his estimation, had become something roughly approximating a fence post, functional, upright, and producing nothing of its own. He had done it because Clara woke with nightmares 3 nights out of 7, crying for her mother in the dark. Because his daughter needed someone, a woman's presence, a steadiness he could not provide from behind the wall he had built around himself and called survival. He needed help with the homestead, that was all. The woman's name was Josephine Crane. She had written from St. Louis, her letter composed in a careful, educated hand. She had mentioned practical things, her willingness to work, her comfort with livestock, her experience keeping a household, and very little else. He had found that reassuring. He did not want poetics. He wanted partnership, nothing more. I hope she likes holly berries, Clara said thoughtfully, placing another one in her circle. I'm making her a welcome decoration. Thomas said nothing. He hoped she was sensible and did not expect what he could not give. The knock, when it finally came, hit the door 3 times, deliberate, measured, not timid. Clara shot to her feet like something released from a spring trap, scattering pinecones across the rug. She's here. She was halfway to the door before Thomas could move. Clara. But his daughter had already grabbed the iron latch and heaved the door open, and the winter wind flooded the cabin, and Thomas Aldridge saw Josephine Crane for the first time. She stood on his porch in the failing afternoon light, and she was not what he had expected. Her coat was thin, far too thin for Montana in December, and it had been mended so many times along the left shoulder that the original fabric was barely visible beneath the layered patches. Her boots were wrapped at the toe in what appeared to be canvas grain sacking tied with twine. She carried a single bag, a traveling satchel of cracked leather, and she held it against her side with one arm pressed close the way people held things they could not afford to lose. But her face was composed. That was the word that rose unbidden in Thomas's mind. Composed, not apologetic, not ashamed. Her dark grey eyes met his across the threshold with the steadiness of someone who had decided, before she ever knocked, exactly what posture she intended to inhabit. "Mr. Aldridge," her voice was even, a little rough from the cold. "I am Josephine Crane. I believe you were expecting me." Clara was already reaching for her hand. "You're frozen," she announced with the same diagnostic certainty she used when evaluating injured birds. "Papa, she's frozen. Let her come in immediately." Thomas stood for a moment that was probably only 2 seconds, but felt considerably longer, staring at the wrapped boots, the patched coat, the single bag. His first instinct was not cruelty. He was not in his marrow a cruel man, but something colder than cruelty, calculation. He had specified in the advertisement that he was a man of modest but stable means. He had expected someone of equally modest but stable circumstance. This woman before him had the bearing of someone who had once been comfortable and had recently lost that comfort so completely that all she retained was the muscle memory of how to stand straight. What had she told him? What had she concealed? What precisely had he agreed to? But Clara was already tugging Josephine across the threshold, small hands wrapped around the stranger's cold fingers, and Thomas found that the door had been taken from him. Josephine had not permitted herself to shiver until she was inside. That had been a decision made somewhere on the long stage ride between Alderton and this valley, when she had understood that her coat would not be enough for Montana's January cold, and that she would arrive looking exactly as impoverished as she was. She had resolved, at that moment, to arrive with her spine straight and her chin level. Whatever Thomas Aldridge thought of her circumstances, he would not find her cringing in them. The cabin was small and rough-hewn, but scrubbed clean and warm. A generous fire blazed in the stone hearth. The furniture was handmade, solid and functional. On the wall near the window, a child's drawing was pinned, a horse and 3 stick figures, one considerably taller than the others. The little girl, Clara, was steering her toward the fireside with a purposeful confidence that made Josephine want to smile despite the exhaustion sitting behind her sternum like a stone. "This spot is the best," Clara said, indicating a ladder-back chair positioned at a precise angle to the hearth. "Papa built this chair. He builds most things. He's very good at it, only he hasn't built much lately." She said the last part as though it were whether information, factual, significant, not requiring comment. Josephine sat. The warmth of the fire hit her in a wave, and she had to very deliberately not close her eyes. Thomas Aldridge stood near the doorway. She was aware of him the way she was aware of a steep drop at the edge of a cliff, a presence that required respectful attention. He was a tall man, spare and weathered, with the careful economy of movement that came from years of physical labor. His face was handsome in the rugged, unornamented way of men who worked outdoors, but his expression had the quality of a window with the shutters drawn. She could see the shape of a face, but not the light behind it. He was watching her. She met his gaze steadily. Clara disappeared and reappeared with a cup of coffee, presenting it with both hands and considerable ceremony. "This is my mother's cup," the child said. The rim had a small chip on one side, repaired with careful filing so the edge would not cut a lip. Mama said things that get repaired properly are stronger than things that never broke. She said the same about people. Josephine accepted the cup. Her hands were steadier than she had any right to expect them to be. Your mother sounds like a very wise woman. She was. Clara looked at her directly. She died 3 years ago. Papa doesn't talk about her much, but I do. I think that's okay. Do you think that's okay, Miss Josephine? I think keeping someone's memory spoken aloud is one of the truest forms of love, Josephine said. Clara considered this with the gravity of a small judge. Then she nodded once, satisfied, and went to sit on the rug to reassemble her scattered holly berries. Josephine drank her coffee and let the warmth work through her and said nothing for a moment, because sometimes silence was the more honest response to a new place. Thomas moved from the doorway at last. He poured himself a cup of coffee at the stove, not sitting, she noticed, but standing, keeping his options open. I'll show you to the spare room, he said. You'll want to rest before supper. I'm quite capable of helping with supper. A pause, rest first. She did not argue. She understood that he needed her to be contained for a while, categorized, while he reassessed. She had recognized the expression on his face when she arrived, not contempt exactly, but the recalibrating look of someone whose expectations had just been substantially revised. She had expected it, she had prepared for it. What she had not prepared for was the small girl who followed her down the narrow hallway to the spare room and stood in the doorway watching her set down her bag with an expression of such open, unguarded hope that it pressed directly on the bruised place behind Josephine's breastbone. I cleaned this room special, Clara confided. I dusted under the bed and everything. Papa helped me, but he made me do most of it because he says you learn the things you do yourself. He's right about that. Josephine looked around the room. Small, clean, a quilt on the narrow bed in blue and cream squares, a nail on the wall where a small wreath of cedar had been hung. Clara's doing, she suspected, not her father's. Do you like it? Clara asked. I think it's one of the finest rooms I've ever had occasion to use, Josephine said, and meant it more than the child could understand. Clara beamed and was gone, footsteps pattering back down the hall. Josephine sat on the edge of the narrow bed and let herself, just briefly, put her face in her hands, not from despair, from the simple, bone-deep relief of having arrived somewhere after a very long journey. She would not permit herself more than a minute of that. She permitted herself 58 seconds. Then she smoothed her dress, straightened her back, and began to unpack the careful, meager contents of her bag. Evening came down soft and gray over the Montana plain. Through the cabin's single east-facing window, Josephine could see the last pale light dying along the horizon, fading from rose to pewter to the deep blue-black of a winter night. Inside, the fire had been stoked, and the lamps lit, and the smell of salt pork and dried beans filled the cabin, supper, plain and hearty, which Thomas had prepared with the efficient, joyless competence of a man accustomed to cooking for necessity rather than pleasure. They ate at the round table near the fire. Thomas ate quickly and in almost complete silence. Clara ate with the cheerful running commentary of a child who understood that someone had to fill the conversational space and had appointed herself to the task. Miss Josephine, did you know that the creek behind our property freezes so solid in January that Papa drives the wagon across it? It's a shortcut to the north pasture. Mama used to say it was like having a second road, only colder. Papa, remember Mama used to say that. I remember, Thomas said. He kept his eyes on his plate. Miss Josephine, do you know how to skate? Mama could skate. She taught me, but I'm not very good yet. Papa used to be very good, but he hasn't skated in. Clara, his voice was quiet, a single word of correction. Clara subsided for approximately 45 seconds, then resumed on a different topic. Josephine ate her beans and salt pork and watched Thomas Aldridge from the careful, peripheral attention she had developed over years of reading classrooms full of children, the attention that appeared to be looking elsewhere while absorbing everything. He had been a different kind of man once. She could see the ghost of it, the set of a jaw that had once known how to relax, hands that had once moved with something other than efficiency, the faint, erased evidence of lines that came from laughing. Grief had not so much changed him, she thought, as evacuated him. The structure remained. The inhabiting light had mostly gone out. She did not say any of this. She was practical enough to know that observation was the work of weeks, not evenings. After supper, Clara negotiated the hanging of her Christmas stocking with the dogged persistence of a skilled attorney, and Josephine was appointed as the necessary second pair of hands. They stood together at the fireplace. The mantelpiece was rough-hewn pine, sturdy and unadorned, except for a single small carved wooden box that Josephine did not look at directly, sensing it was not hers to examine. "Right there," Clara directed, pointing to a nail that had clearly been placed by a previous stocking in a previous year. "That's where it always goes." Josephine lifted the stocking, red wool, a little felted with washing, lovingly knitted, one of the heels recently replaced with a slightly different shade of yarn, and hung it over the nail. "Perfect," she said. Clara stepped back and tilted her head, assessing with the critical eye of an artist judging a canvas. Then she looked up at Josephine with an expression of sudden, unguarded seriousness. "Miss Josephine, can I tell you something honestly?" "I prefer honesty to the alternative," Josephine said. "Papa has forgotten how to want things." Clara's voice was low and careful, as though she'd been carrying this observation for some time and was finally finding someone to hand it to. "He used to want things. He wanted to build a bigger barn and to have a horse with a white blaze and to grow wheat in the south field. Now he just maintains things. He doesn't make plans for new things anymore." She looked at the stocking on the nail. "I think grief does that, takes away the wanting." From the kitchen, Josephine could feel the stillness that meant Thomas had stopped moving. He was listening. She made no indication that she knew it. "Wanting things requires hope," she said to Clara, "and hope requires believing the future holds something worth having. When we lose someone precious, it can be very hard to believe that." "Did you ever lose someone precious?" Clara asked. "My father this past spring." A pause. "It changed my wanting too for a while." Clara slipped her hand into Josephine's, small and warm and trusting. "Did it come back, the wanting?" "It did." Josephine looked at the hanging stocking, at the child's earnest face. "It comes back, eventually, when the right things appear to want." From the kitchen came the sound of a tin cup being set down on the counter, then Thomas's footsteps heading toward the barn door. Clara watched him go, then looked at Josephine with ancient, knowing eyes. "He does that," she said, "goes to the barn when things feel too big inside." Thomas stood at his workbench in the cold dark of the barn and breathed. The horses moved in their stalls, Juniper, his big bay, and the smaller chestnut that had been Elena's and that he had never sold and never quite known what to do with. Their warm, hay-scented presence was the most uncomplicated thing in his life. He gripped the edge of the workbench. It was the same bench where he had once spent winter evenings carving, a cradle for Clara before she was born, a toy horse that had lived in his daughter's arms for 2 solid years, the rocking chair in the main room where Elena had nursed the baby, and which he had not been able to look at directly for a very long time. He had come out here tonight not because the cold was a comfort. It was not, but because the cabin had suddenly felt smaller than its walls. The woman in his kitchen, the woman with the patched coat and the steady eyes and the quiet, careful way of moving through a space as though she was guest enough not to disturb anything, had sat at his table and eaten his food and hung his daughter's stocking, and Clara had held her hand. Clara had held her hand. His daughter, who had learned to be careful with her trust after losing the person she'd trusted most in the world, had taken this stranger's hand as naturally as breathing. He should have expected that to be harder to watch than it was. Through the small barn window, the cabin glowed amber against the blue dark. He could just make out two silhouettes at the fireplace, his daughter, animated, gesturing. The woman beside her, still and attentive. "Elena," he said very quietly, to the dark and the horses and whatever else might be listening, "I don't know what to do with this." Juniper shifted in his stall. The chestnut, Elena's horse, whom Clara had named April in honor of her favorite month, nickered softly. He stood in the cold for another 10 minutes, then he went back inside. The cabin was quiet. Clara had apparently been convinced to go to bed. The main room was empty except for the banked fire and a low lamp left burning on the table. Beside the lamp, folded neatly, was one of Clara's socks, the one she'd snagged on the porch railing that morning, the tear repaired with small, precise stitches in thread close enough to the original color that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking. Thomas looked at it for a long time. Then he went to bed and lay awake for considerably longer than he intended to, and finally slept to dream of Elena's voice singing a carol through rooms he couldn't quite find his way into. Christmas morning came in hard and brilliant, the overnight snow catching the early sun and throwing it back in every direction so that the whole valley blazed with cold light. Thomas woke first by habit, dressed by reflex, went to start the fire before Clara's excitement could take over the morning. He found the main room already warm. Josephine was up, the fire going, coffee on the stove. She stood at the window with a cup in both hands, watching the glittering plane, and turned when she heard him. "Good morning," she said, nothing more. No apology for being up, no explanation, no performance. "Morning," he said, and went to pour his own cup. Clara's footsteps hit the floor above them like a small stampede. She appeared in the doorway in her nightgown and then stopped dead, staring at her stocking with an expression of such pure, arrested joy that Thomas felt something move in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in a while, like ice cracking on a river in February, unexpectedly loud. Inside the stocking was a small carved figure, a meadowlark in flight, wings spread, carved from a scrap of pine with astonishing delicacy, every feather suggested with the press of a knife, the beak open as though mid-song. It had been painted, somehow, with the mineral pigments Josephine must have carried in her bag, in yellow and brown and black. "Miss Josephine made this," Clara breathed, holding it up to the window light. "Papa, look at the wings." "I see them," Thomas said. Josephine was watching from the kitchen doorway with her coffee cup. When Thomas looked at her, she met his gaze steadily. "Meadowlarks are Montana's official bird," she said. "I looked it up before I wrote to you. I wanted to bring something native to this place." He studied her. "You looked up Montana's state bird before you came." "I research places before I travel to them," she said simply. It seemed respectful. She went back to the stove. Clara launched herself at Josephine's waist in gratitude. Over his daughter's head, Thomas turned the carved bird over in his hands, examining the workmanship, the careful wings, the mid-song beak. It was not what he had expected. None of this was what he had expected. The weeks that followed fell into a careful rhythm, the way water finds its course around stones, not forcing, not dramatic, but persistent. Josephine rose early, and had coffee ready when Thomas came in from morning chores. She managed the cabin with quiet competence that went beyond what he had anticipated. She patched a persistent draft above the east window that had bothered him for 2 winters, reorganized the root cellar by type and preservation date so nothing would be lost to rot, discovered that the churn needed a new paddle, and fashioned one from a scrap of hardwood with enough skill that Thomas examined it twice before accepting it was her work. Clara attached herself to Josephine like a small, devoted moon to a planet. "Miss Josephine, can you show me the running stitch? Miss Josephine, what were the children like in your school? Miss Josephine, is it true you can read Latin?" It was. This revelation produced in Clara an expression of pure reverence. "Miss Josephine, Papa is watching you again." That last one, delivered with complete guileless honesty while both adults were present, produced a moment of silence during which Thomas, very deliberately, examined the near wall and Josephine found something to do with the bread dough. He was watching her, he knew it. He wasn't entirely certain what he was watching for. Competence, perhaps, evidence, proof that she was what she appeared to be and not something else. Or perhaps, and this thought he turned away from with practiced discipline, he was watching because she was someone whose company he was beginning, against all intention, to value. He told himself it was the former. One evening in the middle of January, Clara presented him with a needlework sampler she had been completing with Josephine's guidance. The stitching was enthusiastic rather than precise, but the letters were legible. A house is wood and stone, a home is something chosen. Miss Josephine said a teacher in Missouri taught her that, Clara said. It means homes aren't buildings, they're decisions. Right, Miss Josephine? Josephine was by the fire with her mending. Something like that, she said, without looking up. Thomas held the sampler and did not say anything for a moment. "It's fine work, Clara," he said. He tacked it above the kitchen doorway that night. He went to town on the last Thursday of January for supplies. The general store in Callaway Creek smelled of sawdust and dried apples and the particular coal smoke warmth of a wood stove working hard. Thomas gathered his list methodically: flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, and was nearly done when Mrs. Hart, the wife of the banker, materialized at his left elbow with the timing and inevitability of a very sociable ambush. "Mr. Aldridge." Her smile was exactly as wide as it needed to be and no wider. "We've been so curious about your mail-order arrangement. How is the woman settling in?" "Well enough," Thomas said, reaching past her for a tin of baking powder. "I heard," she glanced around the store, and then proceeded to say the thing she had clearly been planning to say since before he arrived, that she arrived in a state of considerable poverty. "Is that so?" "Her circumstances were modest at arrival," Thomas said. "More than modest, I gather." The dressmaker, Mrs. Penfield, appeared at his right, practically destitute from what the stage driver told my husband, patches on her coat and rags on her feet. "Her shoes were practical for the conditions," Thomas said flatly. "And her origins," Mrs. Hart pressed. "Her people, where is she from exactly? One wonders what family produces a woman in such straits." "St. Louis," Thomas said. "St. Louis," Mrs. Penfield exchanged a look with Mrs. Hart, and yet she arrived looking like, a delicate pause, like someone who had fallen quite significantly. One wonders what caused such a fall, doesn't one? What sort of person, from a good city like St. Louis, ends up at an advertisement for a frontier bride with nothing but a patched bag to her name? "The desperate sort," Mrs. Hart said. "Or she lowered her voice to the volume of someone who wants to be heard, "the disreputable sort." Thomas paid for his supplies. He said, "Good day, ladies." He loaded the wagon in the cold and drove home on roads packed with last week's snow, and the women's words rode with him every mile of it. What sort of person? Fallen significantly, desperate, disreputable. He told himself he wasn't listening to them. He arrived home to find Josephine and Clara at the kitchen table, Clara sounding out words in her primer, while Josephine listened with the patient focus of someone for whom this was not labor but vocation. The cabin smelled of bread. The floor had been swept. The lamp glass was polished clean. "Papa," Clara looked up. "Miss Josephine says if I practice every day, I'll be reading all by myself by spring." "That's fine, Clara," Thomas said. He heard himself, the flatness of it. He saw the way Josephine's attention shifted slightly, the way a person's posture shifts when they receive a cold wind they were not expecting, and she returned to the primer without comment. Over the days that followed, he withdrew by degrees, shorter answers, less eye contact, longer hours in the barn or the north pasture, any excuse to reduce the space he occupied in the cabin. The careful warmth of the past weeks, the measured, tentative warmth of two people discovering they might be capable of respect for one another, began to ice over at the edges. Clara felt it first and most. Her brightness dimmed. She watched her father with the careful attention of a child who has learned that fathers can disappear in more ways than one, and she began to look at Josephine with a worry in her small face that Josephine recognized from her years of teaching, the worry of a child who has just begun to love something and has received the first evidence that love is not a permanent guarantee. On the third evening of Thomas's withdrawal, he was passing Clara's room toward the kitchen when he heard his daughter's voice, hushed and intent. "Miss Josephine," a long pause, "are you going to leave?" Thomas stopped. Josephine's answer was a moment in coming. "I am here right now, little bird." "But will you leave, like?" Clara's voice dropped to a whisper so small Thomas had to hold his breath, "like Mama did." The silence that followed was the longest Thomas had ever stood through. He pressed his shoulder against the hallway wall and breathed very carefully through it. "I am not sick," Josephine said gently. "What happened to your Mama is not what is happening now." "But Papa is being different again," Clara said. "The way he gets different when something is wrong, and when things are wrong, they sometimes end." Another pause. "I cannot make you promises about things that are not only mine to promise," Josephine said, "but I can tell you that I am not leaving tonight or tomorrow, and I can tell you that I think you are one of the bravest, clearest-seeing children I have ever known, and that your clear seeing is exactly right. Something is wrong, but wrong things can be put right." A small pause. "Sometimes they need the right person to open a door." "Who's the right person?" Clara whispered. "That," Josephine said, "is the question." Thomas walked to the barn. The night was clear and cold enough to make breathing a conscious act. The stars hung close over the Bitterroot Range, thick and indifferent and very beautiful. Thomas sat at his workbench with the lantern low. On the shelf above, between two coffee tins, his father's Bible. He reached for it without thinking, the way hands reach for familiar things in the dark. It fell open to a page Clara had marked with a length of blue ribbon, Elena's ribbon. He recognized it immediately, the one that had been in her hair on the last good day before the fever took her past reaching. In the margins of the page, Elena's handwriting. She had annotated her Bible for years, small notes in a cramped, slanting hand. "Do not measure what a person is worth by what they carry," she had written, "but by what they refuse to put down even when everything else is gone." He read it 3 times. He had watched Josephine Crane arrive at his door with almost nothing. He had seen the patched coat and the wrapped boots and the single bag, and he had catalogued her poverty with the precision of someone building a case. He had listened to Mrs. Hart and Mrs. Penfield confirm the story he was already telling himself, that poverty was evidence of something, a deficit of character or origin or worth. He had not paused to consider what Josephine had kept. He had not considered her letter, written in careful, honest paragraphs that made no claims she couldn't support. He had not considered the meadowlark, carved from pine and painted with pigments carried in a near-empty bag, placed in his daughter's Christmas stocking as a gift of time and skill when she had nothing else to give. He had not considered the way she had told him, that first evening at the fire, that she was exactly who she appeared to be and had chosen to arrive that way rather than borrow prosperity she did not possess. He had not considered what it cost to make that choice. And he had not considered, not truly, not with the attention it deserved, the way his daughter had reached for Josephine's hand in the first 5 minutes of knowing her, with the instinctive, unswerving trust of a child who reads character without the interference of category. Clara had seen it immediately. He had taken 3 weeks to bury it. Elena would have been disappointed in him. More than that, Elena would have looked at him with the expression she had reserved for moments when he failed to be the man she knew he could be, and said, "Thomas, look again." He looked. He went back inside. The cabin was still, the fire banked low, a lamp burning on the kitchen table. In its light, the carved meadowlark Josephine had made sat on the windowsill, wings spread, beak open mid-song. He went to his workbench, the indoor one, the small table in the corner of the main room where he had once made small things, and found his carving tools where he had set them down 2 years ago. He wiped the dust from the handles. He picked up a block of pale cherry wood he had been saving for something he hadn't yet identified. He worked until the lamp oil ran low. When he stopped, he held up what he'd made and studied it by the last of the light. A flower not skillfully made, his hands were out of practice, and his eye for proportion still recalibrating, but recognizable. 5 petals around a raised center, a stem that curved with something like intention. He set it on the kitchen table. In the morning, it was gone from the table. By evening, he found it on the windowsill above the wash basin, the one that caught the late afternoon light. Neither of them said anything about it. But something had shifted, small and quiet, as a change in wind direction, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. He asked her that evening. Clara had fallen asleep over her primer, worn out from a day of relentless learning, and Thomas had carried her to bed and sat with her for the few minutes required for her breathing to deepen and her hands to unclench from their waking grip on the world. He returned to find Josephine by the dying fire with her mending, the same quiet industry she brought to every hour she was awake. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her without asking. She looked up and then at the cup and then back at her mending. He sat in the chair across from her. The fire snapped once. Outside, the wind had gone to its rest and the night was very still. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that I am asking because I want to understand, not because I intend to judge." She set down her needle. Her hands were still in her lap. "Ask." "Your letter told me practical things." He kept his eyes on the fire. "Your willingness to work, your familiarity with frontier conditions. It didn't tell me much about how you came to be looking for exactly this." He paused. "What happened, Josephine?" A long breath. She looked at the fire too, as though they had both agreed on a neutral third point to direct their attention. "My father was a respected man in St. Louis," she said, "a cotton merchant with a good name and a large house. I was his only child. I was educated, truly educated, not decoratively, because my mother insisted before she died, and my father kept that promise to her at least. A pause. I taught school for 4 years. It was work I loved. And then my father died in April. Her voice was steady. I discovered in the weeks after that the good name and the large house were both built on debt. Everything he owed came due at once. The house, the furniture, my mother's silver, her jewelry, it went piece by piece to settle what he owed, and in the end there was still a balance remaining that I had no means to pay. Another pause. The creditors were lenient in the end. They let me keep the debt but took everything material. Thomas was quiet. The teaching position was given to a married woman, Josephine continued. The board considered an unmarried woman without family connections an insufficient anchor for the position. I had no family remaining to support me, no resources to establish myself independently, and no prospects within the city where I was known only as the merchant's daughter who had lost everything. So you answered the advertisement. I answered 3 advertisements, she said. Yours was the only response that struck me as honest. A small pause. You said you were not looking for romance. You said you needed a practical partner and a steady presence for your daughter. You didn't promise things you couldn't deliver. She looked at him then, directly. I valued that. He met her eyes. You could have borrowed finery, he said, for the arrival made a better impression. I considered it, she said simply. I decided against it. Borrowed finery is a form of deception, and I have found that deceptions, even well-intentioned ones, tend to require other deceptions to sustain them until the whole structure is made of lies and you cannot remember what the original truth was. She looked back at the fire. I preferred to arrive as I am and let you make your decision with full information. That takes courage, Thomas said. It takes practicality, she said, though I'm told the two are sometimes the same thing. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I went to town, he said. 3 weeks ago, women there said things, he paused, unfair things, about what your poverty signified, about your character. I know, she said quietly. He looked at her. How? Because you came home differently than you left. She did not say it with accusation, only with the even, observational tone of someone reporting weather. I have been a school teacher for 4 years, Mr. Aldridge. I know what it looks like when someone has been told to see something differently than their own eyes told them. He was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry, he said, for the withdrawal, for believing, he stopped. For believing the easier story, she finished for him, gently, the one that required less of you. Yes. The fire crackled. The wind had stayed away. Through the east window, moonlight made the snow glow faintly blue. My wife, he said. He had not said it aloud in longer than he could calculate. Not my wife, not with the possessive, the living weight of it. My wife believed that worth was measured in character and not in circumstance. He paused. I nearly forgot that. Josephine said nothing. She waited. I don't want to keep forgetting it, he said. She looked at him, her dark grey eyes steady and clear, the eyes he had first catalogued as composed and had since come to understand was something else, not composed from detachment, but from a deep, hard-won choice about who to be when the world made being someone smaller considerably easier. I don't believe you will, she said. I think you know better. You simply needed reminding. He reached into his coat pocket. He set the carved flower on the table between them, the one he had made in the night 2 weeks ago, the imperfect 5-petaled thing with the too thick stem. He had worked on it since then, quietly, in the early mornings before anyone else was up. The stem was better now. The petals had been thinned with a careful blade until they had the slight translucency of real flower petals held against light. Beside it he placed a small tin box. Inside the box was a ring, a simple thing, a gold band with a small band of engraved leaves around it, modest and beautiful. "This was my wife's mother's ring," he said. "Elena kept it in a box with a note. The note said," he paused, recalling the words he had memorized in the barn by lantern light 3 nights ago. The note said, "For the next woman worthy of your heart, when she appears, you will know her by what she keeps when everything else is taken." Josephine looked at the ring, then at the flower. Her composure, which had held through everything, the cold arrival, the watched weeks, the withdrawal, this conversation shifted, not collapsed, shifted. Something liquid moved beneath the surface of her expression. "I see you, Josephine Crane," Thomas said. He was not a man who spoke easily about the interior things, and the words came out with the roughness of long disuse, but they came. "I see you clearly. I should have been seeing you from the first evening, and I wasn't, and I am ashamed of that, but I see you now." He met her eyes across the small table, across the flower and the tin box and the coffee cups cooling between them. "Your poverty is not a diminishment. It is the frame that shows what you would not sacrifice, your honor, your honesty, your willingness to arrive exactly as you are and let the world take it or leave it." A pause. "I want to take it, if you will still allow me." He reached across the table, very slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, and covered her hands with his. Her fingers were warm beneath his, trembling very slightly. "I would like," he said carefully, "for you to stay, not as a transaction, not as an arrangement or an obligation." As he stopped, the word was very large. He had not used it in 3 years and was not certain his mouth still knew the shape of it. But Josephine was looking at him with eyes that understood what he was working toward, and she did not make him find it. "Yes," she said. Just the one word, just the one, and it was entirely sufficient. "Yes, Thomas, I will stay, and I will earn every hour of your trust." He squeezed her hands. Something he had not realized was tensed in his chest loosened, the way a rope loosens when the load is finally set down. From the hallway came the particular silence of a child who has been awake listening and is now deciding whether to pretend she wasn't. "Clara," Thomas said, without turning. A pause, then small footsteps, and his daughter appeared in the doorway in her nightgown with her hair in 2 wild braids and an expression on her face of such tremendous, carefully suppressed joy that it was almost painful to see. "Is she staying?" Clara whispered. "She's staying," Thomas said. Clara made no sound at all. She crossed the room at speed, wrapped her arms around Josephine's waist, then reached one hand out toward her father without letting go. Thomas took it. For a long moment, the 3 of them were together in the lamplight and the firelight and the deep quiet of a Montana winter night, and Thomas felt, for the first time in years, that the cabin was the right size for its occupants. Sunday came bright and bitterly cold, the kind of sky that was the deepest blue Thomas had ever seen above the white plain. He helped Josephine into the wagon with care that was not about the courtesy of propriety, but about the specific, intentional care of someone choosing to be attentive to a person whose presence matters. She wore her best dress, which was her only dress, carefully pressed and brushed and bearing its patches with the same straightforward dignity its owner brought to everything. She had done something particular with her hair, a style Thomas did not have the vocabulary to name, but recognized as deliberate, as chosen, as the armor of someone preparing to be seen. "You could have taken the blue cloth from the store," Thomas said. He had offered it 2 days ago, and she had declined. "I would have been glad to." "I know," she said. "Thank you, but I would rather be who I am in front of your neighbors than spend the first year of their knowing me maintaining a more comfortable fiction." She settled her gloved hands in her lap. "Let them see what you chose. Let there be no pretense about it." Clara sat between them, holding both their hands, humming the meadowlark carol she had invented over the past week. a private composition of no fixed melody but considerable enthusiasm. Thomas drove the team down the Callaway Road toward town and thought about what he was walking into, and found that he was, somewhat to his surprise, entirely at peace with it. Callaway Creek Church was a white clapboard building at the far end of Main Street, modest and square and clean, full every Sunday with the entirety of a community small enough that everyone's attendance was noted. Thomas had been attending alone with Clara since Alina died. He had become accustomed to the particular weight of people's careful solicitude, the studied kindness of people who know someone has suffered and wish to be seen as compassionate without the inconvenience of actual depth. When he walked through the door with Josephine on his arm and Clara at his side, he felt the heads turn. He kept his eyes forward. After the service, a Christmas season sermon about the virtue of hospitality, which Thomas found either perfectly timed or acutely ironic, the congregation moved into the winter air for the particular ritual of cold weather standing about that people in small communities practiced to demonstrate they were not yet ready to go home. Mrs. Hart appeared with the timing of a woman who had been watching the door. "Mr. Aldridge." She turned her attention to Josephine with a smile that reached somewhere approximately north of her chin and no further. "And this must be your arrangement." "Mrs. Hart," Thomas said, "I'd like to properly introduce you to Josephine Crane, my intended wife." A fractional hesitation in the smile. "How charming, and where are you from, Miss Crane?" "St. Louis," Josephine said. Her voice was pleasant and perfectly level. "St. Louis." Mrs. Penfield appeared at Mrs. Hart's shoulder as though produced from a hat. "And your people, who are your people?" "My father was a cotton merchant," Josephine said. "He died this past spring. My mother died when I was 12. I have no remaining family." "I see," Mrs. Hart said. Her gaze moved, briefly and deliberately, to Josephine's coat. "And your circumstances are you've been managing, that is, you've found Montana very—" She ran out of direction. "Mrs. Hart." Thomas kept his voice even and clear and loud enough that the people around them could hear. "Josephine came to me with honesty instead of borrowed finery, with her actual self rather than a performance. She lost everything material when her father died, and she kept everything essential, her integrity, her education, her willingness to work hard and tell the truth about who she is." He paused. "I have found that to be considerably more valuable than the alternative, and I would suggest that any community worth living in would find the same." A silence fell in the little group. Mr. Hewitt, the blacksmith, was a large, deliberate man who had known Thomas since they were both younger and who had the reputation of saying precisely what he thought and no more and no less. He stepped forward, removing his hat. "Well said," he told Thomas. He turned to Josephine and offered his hand. "Mrs. Hewitt and I would be glad to have you and Tom and the little one to supper any evening that suits. Josephine." His wife, beside him, took Josephine's other hand warmly. "Any friend of Clara's family is welcome at our table. We've been hoping Tom would find his way to a little more living. It's good to see." Others followed, the schoolmaster, who listened with interest when he learned Josephine had taught in Missouri, the Reverend's wife, who asked what reading material she had brought with her and was visibly delighted by the answer, the Tanaka family, who farmed the valley's eastern edge and whose eldest daughter had been in Clara's Sunday school class, extending an invitation with the warm directness of people who assessed strangers by their handshake and found nothing troubling here. Mrs. Hart retreated with a fixed smile and a new topic. Clara, from her position at Josephine's side, watched all of this with the focused attention of a child filing information for later consideration. Then she looked up at Josephine and said, and what she evidently believed was a whisper, "You were right. When you told me honest things don't need to be defended. they just need to be stood in. I did say something like that, Josephine agreed. I'm going to remember it, Clara announced, for when I'm a teacher. Josephine looked down at her. You'd be an excellent teacher. I know, Clara said, with the serene confidence of a child who has been told the truth about herself by someone she believes. Papa says I have a talent for telling people what they ought to already know. Thomas, who had been watching this exchange from 3 feet away, said, I believe I said your talent was for asking questions that exposed what people were trying not to think about. Same thing, Clara said serenely. Josephine laughed, genuinely, not the careful, measured response Thomas had come to recognize as her social register, but the actual thing, bright and startled and warm. He discovered that he very much wanted to be the cause of it again. The ride home was quiet in the manner of people who have said enough hard things for one season and are ready for the ease that follows. They turned onto the Callaway Road with the afternoon sun low and gold behind them, painting their shadows long across the snow. The horses moved at a good pace, glad to be heading toward the barn and the familiar. Clara had fallen asleep against Josephine's arm, her head at the angle of a child who has run out of alertness mid-journey and surrendered to the road's motion. Thomas drove in a silence that was not empty. I owe you more than an apology, he said. I owe you, he stopped, rethinking the construction. I owe you honesty about what this last year has looked like from inside it. Josephine did not look at him. She watched the road, her arm steady around Clara. I am listening, she said. When Alina died, he said carefully, I didn't decide it exactly. It happened and I let it happen. I decided that the kind of love I had for her was a once-in-a-lifetime thing, that a man doesn't get that twice, and to look for it twice would be a diminishment of it somehow, like admitting it could be replaced. He was quiet for a moment. That was the story I told myself to make the fence line around my heart feel like wisdom instead of fear. And now, she said. Now I think, he stopped, started again. I think Alina would have been impatient with me. She was, as a rule, impatient with comfortable lies. He glanced at Josephine, who was looking at him now. She would have told me that loving again doesn't erase what came before, that the heart isn't a finite thing that runs out, that refusing to love again in her honor is the opposite of what she would have wanted. Josephine was quiet for a moment. She sounds, she said carefully, like a woman of considerable wisdom and directness. She was both, Thomas said. You would have, he stopped. You would have been friends, I think. She would have admired the patches on your coat and the carved meadowlark and the way you told me exactly who you were on the first day and dared me to find it insufficient. Josephine's throat moved. She would have approved, Thomas said. Of this, I believe that. Clara stirred slightly between them, murmured something about the schoolmaster's dog, and returned to sleep. They drove in silence the rest of the way. But it was the silence of two people who have finished saying the difficult things and found, on the other side of them, a space that felt clear and navigable. When the cabin came into view, the small square of lamplight that Thomas had left burning in the east window, the snowbanks clean and deep on either side of the path, he pulled the team to a stop 100 yards short of it. Wait, he said. What is it? He was looking at the cabin doorstep. He climbed down from the wagon and walked toward it, then knelt in the snow. Grain. A thin, impossible flush of green pushing through the frozen earth at the base of the door's stone step. 5 or 6 shoots, tender and certain, in a cluster he recognized from years of watching this exact spot every spring. The crocus bed Alina had planted their first year in this cabin, the one that returned every March without fail, the one he had barely registered the last 2 springs because looking at it involved thinking about her. He put out one finger and touched the first shoot, barely an inch above the earth, firm and vital and wholly improbable in January's cold. Behind him he heard Josephine lift a sleeping Clara and set her carefully on her feet, heard Clara half-wake and make a sound of protest and then go still again, leaning against Josephine's side, heard footsteps in the snow, and then they were both beside him. Clara opened her eyes fully, saw the green shoots, and made the small, sharp sound of pure surprise. Mama's flowers. She knelt beside them with the reverence of a child approaching something sacred. Papa, they're here. They come every year, Thomas said. But you never showed me before, Clara said, not accusing, wondering. I know, he looked at her. I should have. Josephine had crouched beside Clara, studying the shoots. They've been here waiting all along, she said softly, beneath everything winter put over them, just waiting for enough warmth to push through. Clara looked up at her, like us. Like many things, Josephine said. Thomas stood. He looked at the green shoots, small and brave and entirely certain of the spring that was coming, and felt, he had no better word for it, felt the loosening of something that had been cinched tight for a very long time. He offered Josephine his hand. She took it, rose, met his eyes. Welcome home, he said, truly and finally. She looked at the cabin, at the lamplight in the window, at Clara still crouching over the chutes with one careful finger extended. Then she looked at him. I believe I am, she said. Clara stood and took Josephine's other hand, and they crossed the last few feet of snow to the cabin door, the three of them, complete where there had been incomplete, warm where there had been cold, and Thomas held the door and they went inside. The fire was banked but not out. It took 3 minutes' attention to bring it back to full light. Clara installed herself on the rug to continue an interrupted conversation with the carved meadowlark on the windowsill. Thomas put water on for coffee. Josephine stood at the east window and looked out at the snow and the sky and the thin line of light still visible on the western horizon. Thomas, she said. He turned. I want to teach school again. She said it carefully, the way people say things they have been holding for a while. Not instead of this, not instead of being here, being what I came here to be, but alongside it, if there is a school board, if there is a need. She paused. I think Clara is going to be reading independently within 6 weeks. And there are other children in this valley who could use. I'll speak to the schoolmaster, Thomas said. Hewitt's been saying for a year that the Tanaka children need a second instructor, that their eldest is capable of much more than what a single teacher can provide. She turned from the window and looked at him. You don't mind. Josephine, he brought her coffee. The note my wife left said, for the next woman worthy of your heart, worth is not a fixed quantity, it doesn't decrease with use. He set the cup beside her. I did not bring you here to extinguish you. She took the cup. Her eyes were bright. No, she said, I didn't think you had, but it matters to have it said. Clara looked up from the rug. Miss Josephine is going to teach me Latin, she announced. And then I am going to be the only person in Callaway Creek who knows Latin. And then I am going to be a school teacher and teach other people Latin, and we'll all know it. That's a comprehensive plan, Josephine said. I'm a comprehensive person, Clara said, and returned to her meadowlark. Thomas sat in the chair that was his by habit and position, and Josephine sat in the chair that was becoming hers, and between them the fire burned and Clara murmured Latin vocabulary she had invented for the meadowlark's instruction, and the cabin was the right size and the right warmth and the right company. Through the east window, the last of the winter light faded. The stars began to appear, first one and then many, the way they did on clear Montana nights, not all at once, but progressively, each one announcing itself as the sky darkened enough to be worthy of it. Outside by the door, beneath the January snow, 5 small green shoots stood their ground against the cold, waiting as green things always wait, for spring to come and find them ready.